Introduction. In the middle of the 20th century, two scientists conducted separate experiments that possessed the potential to fundamentally alter our understanding of human behavior. Their findings were profound, yet they remained largely unheeded by the wider world for decades. The story begins in the 1940s with a psychology professor named Harry F. Harlow, who established one of the very first laboratories dedicated to the study of primate behavior at the University of Wisconsin. During a 2-week learning experiment in 1949, Harlow and his team placed a simple mechanical puzzle inside the cages of 8 rhesus monkeys. The puzzle required a sequence of 3 distinct steps to solve: removing a vertical pin, unfastening a hook, and lifting a hinged cover. The researchers intended to observe the animals and prepare them for a formal test of their cognitive prowess. Before any official prompts or external urgings could be administered, a peculiar phenomenon occurred. The monkeys spontaneously began engaging with the puzzles. They worked with intense focus and sheer determination, demonstrating an unmistakable sense of enjoyment as they quickly deciphered the mechanical contraptions. By the time the formal testing days arrived, the primates were exceptionally skilled, routinely cracking the mechanism in under a minute. This spontaneous mastery presented a profound scientific anomaly. At the time, the scientific community accepted that behavior was propelled by only 2 primary drives. The first was a biological imperative, dictating that living creatures act to satiate fundamental survival needs such as hunger, thirst, and reproduction. The monkeys, however, received no food, water, or sexual gratification for solving the puzzle. The second accepted drive involved environmental forces, positing that behavior is shaped entirely by external rewards and punishments. If an organism was promised a tangible benefit or threatened with a penalty, it would adjust its behavior accordingly. Yet the monkeys had not been offered affection, quiet applause, or any other external incentive. Faced with behavior that defied existing paradigms, Harlow proposed a revolutionary concept, a third drive. He theorized that the sheer act of performing the task provided an internal sense of gratification. The monkeys solved the puzzles simply because they found the intellectual challenge intrinsically rewarding. The joy of the activity was its own distinct reward. To test the boundaries of this newly identified intrinsic motivation, Harlow introduced an external reward system, assuming that offering the monkeys raisins for their success would further enhance their puzzle-solving efficiency. Astonishingly, the introduction of food had the exact opposite effect. The external reward disrupted their innate focus, causing the primates to make more errors and solve the contraptions less frequently. Recognizing the monumental implications of these results, Harlow urged the scientific establishment to discard its outdated theories and embrace a more accurate, holistic view of behavior that included this powerful third drive. Unfortunately, the prevailing scientific dogma was too entrenched, and Harlow ultimately abandoned this controversial line of inquiry, leaving the profound concept of intrinsic motivation to languish on the periphery of psychological literature. 2 decades later, an ambitious psychology graduate student named Edward Deci decided to pick up the conceptual thread that Harlow had left behind. In the summer of 1969, Deci gathered male and female university students to participate in an experiment centered around the Soma puzzle cube, a popular geometric game that could be assembled into millions of different configurations. Deci divided the participants into 2 groups, an experimental group and a control group, and evaluated them over 3 consecutive daily sessions. During each 1-hour session, the students were tasked with replicating specific puzzle drawings while Deci timed them. In the middle of the experiment, Deci would manufacture an excuse to leave the room for exactly 8 minutes, claiming he needed to process their completion times in an external computer system. In reality, he retreated to an observation room with a one-way mirror to secretly monitor what the participants chose to do with their free time. Would they continue grappling with the puzzle, or would they distract themselves by reading the magazines left on the table? During the first session, both groups exhibited genuine intrinsic interest, spending several minutes of their free time voluntarily playing with the puzzle. On the second day, the experimental group was offered a financial reward for every configuration they successfully assembled, while the control group remained unpaid. Predictably, the promise of cash dramatically intensified the experimental group's focus. They spent the vast majority of their free choice period relentlessly working on the puzzles, driven by the prospect of earning money. The critical revelation unfolded on the third day. Detsy informed the previously compensated group that funding had run out, meaning the final session would be entirely unpaid. Left alone during the secret 8-minute observation window, the unpaid control group continued to show steady, even slightly increased, engagement with the puzzle. In stark contrast, the experimental group, having tasted financial reward and then lost it, showed a severe collapse in motivation. They spent significantly less time engaging with the puzzle than they had on the very first day when they initially discovered the joy of the game. Detsy's research provided undeniable evidence that human motivation is governed by principles that directly contradict conventional wisdom. It shattered the deeply ingrained belief that cold, hard cash invariably enhances performance and interest. When tangible external rewards are utilized to compel behavior, subjects systematically lose their intrinsic fascination with the activity itself. While external incentives can deliver a temporary surge in output similar to a brief caffeine high, the effect inevitably dissipates and exacts a long-term toll on a person's underlying desire to engage with the work. Human beings possess an inherent, enduring tendency to seek out novelty, to explore their environments, and to stretch the limits of their capacities. However, this intrinsic third drive is profoundly fragile and requires the correct environmental conditions to survive. A reliance on external control systems and monetary rewards actively destroys this delicate motivational state. The tragedy of the modern era is that our collective institutions have failed to internalize this vital understanding. Governments, non-profits, and commercial enterprises continue to build their operational frameworks upon unexamined folklore rather than rigorous behavioral science. By aggressively deploying short-term incentive plans and pay-for-performance schemes, organizations are implementing measures that rarely work and frequently inflict lasting harm. This fundamental misunderstanding has even infected educational systems, where students are routinely bribed with material goods to learn. There is a desperate need to repair the glaring breach between what science knows and what business actually does, shifting away from a flawed system of rewards and punishments toward a dynamic view of human potential. Chapter 1. The Rise and Fall of Motivation. Imagine traveling back to the year 1995 and sitting down with a highly credentialed economics professor. You present her with a hypothetical forecasting challenge involving two distinct models for creating a comprehensive, world-class encyclopedia. The first model is funded by a massive, highly profitable technology corporation. This corporation employs professional managers who oversee well-compensated writers and editors, ensuring the project stays on budget and delivers a polished product to be sold for profit. The second model operates entirely outside the traditional corporate sphere. It relies on tens of thousands of amateur hobbyists contributing their time and expertise for absolutely no financial compensation. Furthermore, the resulting encyclopedia will be given away entirely for free. You ask the economist to predict which model will dominate the market in 15 years. In 1995, any rational economic thinker would have confidently selected the corporate model without a moment's hesitation. The alternative would have seemed absurd, running contrary to every established principle of business. The corporate model provided the correct incentives, whereas the volunteer project actively cost its contributors valuable time and potential income. Yet, as history reveals, the corporate Goliath, Microsoft Encarta, was ultimately discontinued after failing to compete, while the ragtag volunteer project, Wikipedia, evolved into the largest and most popular encyclopedia in human history. This monumental triumph of an unpaid, decentralized workforce presents a massive problem for our conventional understanding of human motivation. To comprehend why, we must view society as running on a hidden operating system, much like the invisible layer of software that manages the hardware of a computer. Our societal operating system relies on deeply embedded assumptions about human behavior. In the earliest days of human history, our ancestors operated on what we might call Motivation 1.0, an elegant but primitive system entirely focused on biological survival, gathering food and evading predators. As societies grew more intricate and required widespread cooperation, this biological drive proved insufficient and occasionally disruptive. Consequently, humanity engineered an upgrade, Motivation 2.0. This new system recognized that humans, while biological creatures, also possess a powerful secondary drive to seek external rewards and avoid external punishments. This carrot-and-stick approach became the foundational engine of economic progress, particularly during the Industrial Revolution. It was formalized in the early 20th century by an engineer named Frederick Winslow Taylor, who pioneered scientific management. Taylor viewed workers as mere cogs in a complex industrial machine. If you rewarded the behaviors you wanted and punished those you did not, the machine would run with flawless efficiency. Motivation 2.0 assumed that humans were inherently resistant to effort and needed a dangling carrot or a sharp stick to move in the right direction. Despite its uninspiring view of humanity, it was remarkably effective for a very long time. As the 20th century progressed and work became increasingly sophisticated, scholars like Abraham Maslow and Douglas MacGregor recognized the limitations of this mechanistic view. They argued that humans possess higher intrinsic drives, leading to a softer, more flexible management style, what we might deem motivation 2.1. However, this was merely a superficial patch rather than a fundamental rewrite of the code. Today, in an era marked by rapid technological advancement and staggering economic shifts, the sturdy old operating system of motivation 2.0 is constantly crashing. It is fundamentally incompatible with the modern world in three distinct critical ways. First, the traditional carrot-and-stick model is incompatible with how we increasingly organize what we do. Wikipedia's success is not a statistical anomaly. It represents the formidable power of the open-source business model. From the Firefox web browser to the Linux operating system and Apache web servers, some of the most critical infrastructure in the global economy is built and maintained by armies of unpaid volunteers. Researchers studying these open-source networks have discovered that the primary driver for these programmers is enjoyment-based intrinsic motivation, the profound satisfaction of mastering a complex challenge and contributing a gift to a community. Motivation 2.0 has absolutely no framework for processing this. Furthermore, new legal and corporate structures are emerging globally, such as low-profit limited liability corporations, L3Cs, social businesses, and B corporations. Traditional businesses operate as profit maximizers, aligning perfectly with Motivation 2.0. These new entities, however, are purpose maximizers, fundamentally flouting the rules of the old operating system. Second, Motivation 2.0 is incompatible with how modern economics tells us we actually think about what we do. For decades, traditional economics assumed that humans were perfectly rational calculating machines, constantly weighing the costs and benefits of every action to maximize personal wealth. This hyper-rational economic man was the exact psychological profile required for Motivation 2.0 to function reliably. However, the rise of behavioral economics, spearheaded by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman and researchers like Dan Ariely, has conclusively proven that human beings are predictably irrational. We routinely reject free money if we feel a transaction is unfair, we fail to save for retirement despite the clear economic advantage, and we hang on to bad investments simply to avoid the emotional pain of a loss. If humans act for complex, emotional, and non-rational reasons in the financial realm, it stands to reason that we also act for transcendent, self-actualizing reasons. We frequently leave lucrative careers for lower-paying jobs that offer a sense of meaning, and we dedicate our weekends to mastering instruments without any hope of financial return. Motivation 2.0 relies on a robotic view of human behavior that modern science has wholly discredited. Finally, the old operating system is incompatible with how we actually do what we do in the modern workplace. Behavioral scientists divide tasks into two categories, algorithmic and heuristic. Algorithmic tasks require following a strict, established set of instructions down a single pathway to arrive at one specific conclusion. Heuristic tasks demand the opposite. Because no strict algorithm exists, individuals must experiment, think creatively, and devise novel solutions. In the 20th century, the vast majority of work was algorithmic, making carrots and sticks highly effective. Today, routine algorithmic work is rapidly disappearing. It is either being outsourced to cheaper labor markets overseas or entirely automated by software. The overwhelming majority of modern job growth is in heuristic, creative, non-routine work. As Harvard researcher Teresa Amabile has demonstrated, while external rewards work nicely for algorithmic duties, they can be absolutely devastating to heuristic, creative tasks. The central tenets of Motivation 2.0 actively impair the exact right brain cognitive abilities that modern economies depend upon. Additionally, the rise of self-employment and telecommuting means that millions of workers are now operating beyond the watchful gaze of a manager. They are not being constantly monitored, meaning they must be entirely self-directed. A system built on external coercion cannot sustain a workforce that must operate with internal autonomy. Ultimately, the Motivation 2.0 operating system is failing because it rests on the assumption that human beings are purely profit maximizers driven by routine and control. The reality of the 21st century is that we are fully realized, intrinsically motivated purpose maximizers performing creative, self-directed work. To build a framework that actually functions in this new reality, we must take a much closer look at the specific, systemic bugs inherent in the carrot and stick approach. Chapter 2. 7 Reasons Carrots and Sticks Often Don't Work. To understand the mechanics of traditional motivation, one might look to the elegant simplicity of Sir Isaac Newton's first law of motion. An object at rest will stay at rest, and an object in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. For decades, the operating system of Motivation 2.0 relied on a remarkably similar premise. It posited that rewarding an activity guarantees an increase in that activity, while punishing a behavior ensures its reduction. In the macro world of predictable, routine human endeavor, this Newtonian view of management appears to map perfectly onto our social and economic environments. However, just as the cool, rational laws of classical physics unravel at the subatomic level, giving way to the bizarre, unpredictable realm of quantum mechanics, the traditional rules of motivation break down when they collide with our intricate third drive. Before exploring these behavioral anomalies, a fundamental prerequisite must be established. Every individual requires a baseline of fair and adequate compensation. If a person's basic wages, benefits, and working conditions are insufficient, their mind will be consumed by the anxiety and unfairness of their circumstance. In such a state, no motivational strategy can succeed. But once this vital threshold of baseline rewards is met, the deployment of carrots and sticks often triggers a paradoxical reaction, producing the exact opposite of their intended aims. When evaluating the failures of these traditional motivators, we find that they consistently deliver far less of what we actively want, beginning with the suppression of our most genuine source of energy. A profound lesson in this phenomenon is embedded in Mark Twain's classic literature, specifically when a young Tom Sawyer is tasked with the grueling chore of whitewashing his aunt's massive fence. Faced with a dreary afternoon of manual labor, Tom enacts a brilliant psychological deception, convincing his friends that slapping paint on a fence is not a punishment but a rare and magnificent privilege. Soon, the other boys are surrendering their own treasures just for the opportunity to do his work. From this, Twain extracts a masterful insight into the human condition. Work consists of whatever a body is obliged to do, and play consists of whatever a body is not obliged to do. By introducing a mandatory external reward or demand, we risk triggering what is known as the Sawyer effect, a dark behavioral alchemy capable of transforming an inherently fascinating task into a miserable drudge. This brings us directly to the devastating impact rewards have on intrinsic motivation. In the 1970s, behavioral researchers identified the hidden costs of rewards by observing preschoolers who possessed a natural, unprompted love for drawing. The researchers divided the children into 3 groups. The first group was shown a personalized good player certificate and asked if they wanted to draw in order to win it. The second group was asked simply if they wanted to draw, but were surprisingly handed the certificate afterward. The third group was asked to draw with no promise or delivery of any reward whatsoever. Weeks later, the researchers secretly observed the classrooms during a free play period. The children who received the unexpected reward, as well as those who received no reward at all, continued to draw with the exact same passion and frequency as before. However, the children in the first group, those who had been offered a contingent if-then reward, showed a severe drop in interest, spending far less time with the markers and paper. The promise of the prize had fundamentally altered their relationship with the activity. When an individual is offered an if-then reward, they are essentially forced to forfeit a portion of their autonomy. They are no longer the absolute authors of their own actions. and this subtle shift in control acts as a leak in their motivational bucket, slowly draining the inherent joy from the task. This degradation of internal drive directly compromises high performance. To test the efficacy of financial incentives, a group of esteemed economists traveled to Madurai, India, where the lower cost of living allowed them to offer massive financial payouts without bankrupting their research grants. They asked participants to engage in a series of games requiring concentration, memory, and physical dexterity, offering 3 tiers of rewards: a small payout equivalent to a day's wages, a medium payout equal to 2 weeks' wages, and a massive payout equal to nearly 5 months' pay. The results completely defied traditional corporate logic. The individuals offered the medium reward performed no better than those offered the small one. Astonishingly, the participants vying for the largest 5-month payout performed the worst of all across nearly every cognitive task. This finding has been verified by leading economic institutions globally, confirming that introducing heavy financial incentives frequently leads to a severe negative impact on overall execution. This cognitive friction brings us to another disastrous consequence: the crushing of creativity. In the 1930s, psychologist Carl Duncker devised the famous candle problem, providing subjects with a candle, a book of matches, and a box of thumbtacks, then asking them to attach the candle to a wall so the wax wouldn't drip onto the table below. To succeed, individuals must overcome functional fixedness, the tendency to see the box only as a receptacle for the tacks rather than as a platform for the candle. When researchers later timed participants solving this puzzle, they added a twist. Half were told they were merely establishing a baseline time, while the other half were promised significant cash prizes for finishing in the top percentile. In direct defiance of Motivation 2.0, the group incentivized by cash took an average of 3.5 minutes longer to arrive at the solution. The fundamental nature of a reward is that it aggressively narrows our focus. When a task requires following a simple, linear algorithm, a narrowed focus is highly beneficial. However, when a challenge requires heuristic conceptual thinking, where the solution lies on the periphery and demands a creative leap, a narrowed focus acts as a blinder. The dangling carrot obscures the broader perspective required for innovation. This is why artists who paint commissioned pieces frequently report feeling constrained, and independent panels of experts routinely judge their commissioned artworks to be significantly less creative than the pieces they paint purely for themselves. Furthermore, the introduction of external rewards has the tragic ability to crowd out good behavior. For decades, sociologists speculated that paying citizens to donate blood would actually decrease the nation's blood supply because it would tarnish the moral purity of the act. Swedish researchers eventually tested this hypothesis, dividing willing donors into groups. One group was asked to donate voluntarily, while another was offered a cash payment. The results were stark. The promise of money slashed the donation rate nearly in half. Blood donation is fundamentally an act of altruism, but the sudden introduction of cash shifted the decision from a moral obligation into a cheap, commercial transaction. There simply wasn't psychological room for both frameworks to coexist, and the external payment crowded out the intrinsic desire to do good. In the upside-down universe of our third drive, the damage does not stop at diminishing what is desirable. The deployment of extrinsic motivators frequently gives us more of what we actively do not want, beginning with unethical behavior. Modern management preaches the absolute necessity of setting strict, measurable goals. However, when an extrinsic goal is elevated above all else, be it a quarterly revenue target, a standardized test score, or a strict sales quota, it fundamentally restricts an individual's ethical vision. History is littered with the wreckage of goals gone wild: automotive repair shops fabricating necessary repairs to hit daily quotas, corporate executives manipulating accounting sheets to trigger massive bonuses, and manufacturers skipping critical safety checks to launch products on an aggressive timeline. When the reward is the only destination that matters, individuals will inevitably seek the quickest possible route, even if that route requires taking the low road of cheating and deception. In stark contrast, when a person is intrinsically motivated by the sheer desire to master a craft or serve a purpose, there are no shortcuts. Taking the low road is impossible because the individual would only be cheating themselves. Interestingly, leveraging the negative side of Motivation 2.0, the threat of punishment, can be equally disastrous in shaping conduct. When economists studied daycare centers in Israel struggling with parents who routinely arrived late to pick up their children, they introduced a financial fine for tardiness. According to traditional logic, penalizing the behavior should have reduced it. Instead, after the fine was introduced, the rate of late arrivals actually doubled. Before the penalty, parents felt an intrinsic moral obligation to be punctual out of fairness to the teachers. The fine completely eradicated that moral framework, replacing it with a clean transaction. Parents felt they were simply purchasing extra time. The punishment did not halt the bad behavior, it implicitly permitted and expanded it. This reliance on external reinforcement uncovers a terrifying psychological parallel: addiction. According to complex economic models, the very act of offering a reward signals to the recipient that the required task is inherently undesirable. In order to initiate action, the manager, or principal, must offer a prize. But once that initial transaction occurs, the principal is trapped. The reward soon feels less like a bonus and more like an entitled status quo. To maintain the same level of compliance in the future, the reward must be offered again, and it must continually grow in size to achieve the same effect. This is not merely a theoretical model. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, has allowed neuroscientists to watch this exact process unfold in the human brain. When individuals anticipate a financial reward, a massive burst of dopamine floods the nucleus accumbens. This physiological response is virtually identical to the neurological mechanisms triggered by highly addictive substances like cocaine and nicotine. The intense rush of anticipation thrills the brain, quickly dissipates, and then demands an even larger dose. This neurochemical hijack also severely distorts decision-making, increasing the likelihood that individuals will engage in reckless, risk-seeking behaviors, the very mechanisms exploited by casinos. Finally, the pursuit of the immediate payoff fosters a dangerous culture of short-term thinking. Just as the subjects in the candle problem became so fixated on the prize that they lost their peripheral vision, organizations fixated on immediate rewards systematically lose their depth of vision. When executives become obsessed with a narrow, near-term slice of corporate performance, they inevitably sacrifice the distant horizon. Companies that focus myopically on offering quarterly earnings guidance to please stock analysts routinely experience lower long-term growth and invest significantly less in vital research and development. They prioritize the transient blip of today's reward over the enduring health of tomorrow's enterprise. This extrinsically motivated nearsightedness is the fundamental architecture of economic bubbles and catastrophic market collapses. Genuine mastery, by its very nature, demands a long-term view, as true excellence requires pushing continuously toward a horizon that can never fully be reached. In summary, the traditional deployment of carrots and sticks suffers from a deeply embedded series of 7 deadly flaws. By relying strictly on external controls, we run the severe risk of extinguishing a person's intrinsic motivation and actively diminishing their overall performance. We inadvertently crush their capacity for creativity and crowd out their natural inclinations toward good behavior. Simultaneously, we lay the groundwork for a toxic environment that encourages cheating, shortcuts, and unethical conduct. We foster a psychological dependency that mimics the relentless cycle of chemical addiction, and we enforce a dangerous myopia that prioritizes short-term thinking over long-term greatness. Chapter 3. And the special circumstances when they do. It would be a mistake to declare traditional incentives entirely devoid of value. If external motivators were universally destructive, the traditional operating system of behavior would never have survived the industrial era, nor would it have built the foundations of modern commerce. While an over-reliance on carrots and sticks is a deeply flawed strategy for the complexities of the modern world, a complete rejection of these tools ignores the nuanced realities of human behavior. Behavioral science does not demand that we abandon rewards entirely. Rather, it asks us to recognize the incredibly narrow, specific band of circumstances in which they actually function properly. Before navigating the mechanics of when to apply external pressure, a non-negotiable prerequisite must be established. The baseline of compensation must be adequate and fair. Whether in the form of salaries, hourly wages, or vital benefits. If individuals feel they are being compensated poorly, or if they perceive an inequity between their pay and the pay of their peers, their cognitive bandwidth will be entirely consumed by resentment and financial anxiety. In an environment devoid of this fundamental fairness, no motivational strategy, neither the sharpest stick nor the most enlightened appeal to purpose, can take root. Once this baseline is securely met, however, we can begin to identify the rare moments where external rewards can be deployed effectively. The key to understanding these special circumstances requires a return to the behavioral puzzle involving the candle, the matches, and the box of thumbtacks. When researchers altered the presentation of the puzzle, simply by taking the tacks out of the box and placing them on the table, the cognitive challenge fundamentally shifted. Because the box was no longer perceived solely as a container for the tacks, the participants did not have to overcome functional fixedness. The solution was immediately obvious. The challenge had been downgraded from a complex, heuristic problem requiring a creative leap into a simple, linear, algorithmic task. Under these specific conditions, when the path to success was completely visible and required no innovative thinking, the participants who were offered a financial prize worked significantly faster than those who were not. This reveals the primary threshold question any leader must ask before introducing an external incentive. Is the task at hand routine? If an assignment requires merely following a prescribed set of instructions to reach a predetermined outcome, the inherent risks of external rewards are neutralized. There is no intrinsic motivation to extinguish, and there is no delicate peripheral vision to blind. For the vast array of mundane, algorithmic duties that still populate our daily lives, from stuffing envelopes to entering rows of data, traditional rewards can provide a temporary motivational booster shot without the toxic side effects. However, even when applying rewards to routine drudgery, leadership must be careful not to trigger resentment. If a team is asked to sacrifice a weekend for a mind-numbing administrative chore, offering a cash bonus or a celebratory dinner is a pragmatic move. Yet, to maximize the effectiveness of this transaction, the reward should be paired with 3 vital communication strategies. First, leaders must offer a compelling rationale for the work, connecting the tedious chore to the broader, meaningful mission of the organization. Second, they must exhibit empathy by openly acknowledging that the task is inherently boring. Finally, they must grant the individuals as much autonomy as possible over how the work is completed. Dictate the required destination, but allow the team the freedom to choose their own route. When the nature of the work shifts from the algorithmic to the heuristic, when the job demands artistry, complex problem-solving, or conceptual innovation, the deployment of rewards must be handled with extreme caution. Creative professionals still require financial sustenance, but the science definitively proves that contingent, if-then incentives actively strangle the creative process. If a leader attempts to bribe a team into producing a groundbreaking design by promising a bonus for a specific outcome, the resulting work will almost certainly be less innovative. The pressure of the contingent reward narrows focus and stifles the willingness to take necessary creative risks. To navigate this delicate terrain, organizations must pivot away from contingent bribes and embrace the concept of the unexpected post-completion bonus. If a team successfully navigates a complex creative challenge and delivers exceptional work, presenting them with a tangible reward after the fact recognizes their excellence without having distorted their creative journey. Because this now-that reward was not dangled at the outset, it could not blind their peripheral vision. Yet, even this strategy carries a hidden danger. If these post-completion bonuses become a predictable routine, they quickly calcify into expected entitlements, transforming back into the very if-then constraints they were meant to avoid. Ultimately, the most effective rewards for complex, non-routine work are often intangible. Sincere, specific praise and constructive feedback are far less corrosive than financial bonuses. When leadership provides meaningful information about an individual's strategy and effort, rather than merely judging their final output, it feeds the deep psychological hunger to master a craft. When to use rewards. A simple flowchart. Navigating the treacherous waters of motivation can be distilled into a clear decision-making process. Whenever a task is presented, the first determination must be whether the work is strictly routine, If the answer is yes, external incentives are permissible, provided they are accompanied by a clear rationale, an acknowledgement of the tedium, and a degree of operational autonomy. If the answer is no, if the work requires any measure of conceptual thinking or creativity, contingent rewards must be strictly avoided. Instead, leaders must ensure that baseline compensation is generous and fair, cultivate an environment that fosters deep self-direction, and limit any additional incentives to unexpected, retrospective gestures of appreciation and highly specific informational feedback. Chapter 4. Autonomy. On a rainy Friday afternoon in Charlottesville, Virginia, the bustling energy typically associated with a thriving technology enterprise is noticeably absent. Inside the offices of Medius, a company designing complex information systems for hospitals, only a fraction of the workforce is actually at their desks. Yet, the chief executive, Jeff Gunther, harbors no anxiety about lost productivity or slacking employees. Earlier that year, Gunther initiated a radical operational shift, transforming his company into a results-only work environment, or ROE. Born from the minds of two former corporate executives, the ROE philosophy represents a complete departure from the rigid schedules of the industrial age. Employees are no longer bound by specific hours or physical presence in an office. They are solely accountable for the work they produce. How, when, and where they accomplish their objectives is entirely up to them. Initially, the transition was jarring. Workers conditioned by decades of micromanagement and strict corporate oversight were hesitant to embrace such an expansive leash. But within weeks, the psychological climate of the company transformed. Stress evaporated, productivity surged, and the team became intensely focused on the craftsmanship of their work rather than the performative act of simply being present. Gunther realized that once a business meets the threshold of fair baseline compensation, money ceases to be the driving force behind exceptional performance. What truly binds top-tier talent to an organization, and what inspires their deepest creative output, is the unparalleled freedom to direct their own professional lives. To treat employees as resources to be manipulated is an archaic failure of leadership. Treating them as fully autonomous partners is the architecture of the future. This realization forces us to confront a profound philosophical divide regarding human nature. Are we fundamentally designed to be players or pawns? Management itself is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. It is an invented technology, engineered over a century ago to ensure compliance and predictability in a rapidly industrializing world. The foundational premise of traditional management is that human beings are inherently passive and inert. It assumes that, without the sharp sting of punishment or the sweet lure of a reward, people would simply do nothing. But a brief observation of any young child effortlessly dismantles this cynical view. We enter the world ablaze with curiosity, actively exploring our environment, and completely self-directed. If an adult exhibits chronic passivity in the workplace, it is not because passivity is their natural state. It is because the heavy, controlling hand of management has systematically altered their default setting. Self-determination theory posits that autonomy is an innate, universal human need, distinctly different from the Western ideal of rugged, isolated independence. Autonomy is simply the capacity to act with volition and choice, allowing us to be entirely self-directed while remaining deeply interconnected with others. When this fundamental need is supported, the results are undeniable. Individuals exhibit higher psychological well-being, deeper conceptual understanding, and unparalleled productivity. Conversely, attempts to simulate freedom through corporate buzzwords like empowerment or flex time ultimately fail because they are merely softer, more civilized expressions of control. The modern economic landscape does not require better management. It demands a total renaissance of self-direction. To cultivate this deep level of intrinsic motivation, organizations must grant their people sovereignty over the 4 essentials of work. The first of these is autonomy over task. In the early 2000s, the founders of the Australian software company Atlassian initiated a bold experiment. Once a quarter, they gave their engineers a full 24 hours to work on any project they desired, entirely outside of their regular responsibilities, so long as they delivered a result by the next afternoon. These intense bursts of unbridled freedom produced a staggering array of software patches, fresh codes, and innovative product ideas. Recognizing the immense value of this untethered creativity, Atlassian eventually expanded the initiative, allowing developers to dedicate 20% of their regular working hours to self-directed projects. This concept traces its roots back to the visionary leadership of William McKnight at 3M in the mid-20th century. By encouraging his technical staff to engage in experimental doodling with a portion of their paid time, McKnight laid the fertile ground for some of the company's most lucrative inventions, including the ubiquitous Post-it note. Decades later, Google adopted the exact same framework, yielding world-changing products like Gmail and Google News. When individuals are given the trust and space to follow their own intellectual curiosities, they consistently produce breakthroughs that heavily monitored top-down directives could never mandate. The second essential dimension is autonomy over time. The legal profession provides a tragic case study in what happens when this sovereignty is stripped away. Despite high salaries, lawyers routinely report catastrophic levels of career dissatisfaction. While the adversarial nature of the work plays a role, the primary culprit is the billable hour. Forcing professionals to account for their existence in 6-minute increments violently shifts their cognitive focus away from the creative output of solving a client's problem and onto the mechanical input of accumulating time. It transforms a complex heuristic puzzle into a grueling marathon of endurance. A results-only work environment annihilates this paradigm. By decoupling the concept of work from the arbitrary constraints of a clock, organizations allow people to integrate their professional and personal lives organically. When the focus remains solely on the excellence of the final result, the artificial panic of the tardy slip and the time clock vanishes. The third element is autonomy over technique. Consider the bleak reality of the traditional customer service call center. Employees are typically confined to tight cubicles, tethered to headsets, and forced to read rigid scripts while supervisors secretly monitor their call durations. It is a soul-crushing environment designed to strip the worker of all decision latitude, resulting in astronomical turnover rates. Yet the online retailer Zappos completely subverted this model. They hire for cultural fit, offer extensive training, and then give their representatives complete freedom over how they handle customer calls. There are no scripts and no arbitrary time limits. Their only objective is to serve the customer extraordinarily well. By returning the technique of the job to the employee, Zappos forged one of the highest-rated customer service teams in the world and virtually eliminated employee turnover. The final dimension is autonomy over team. In almost all traditional employment, workers have no voice in selecting the individuals they spend the majority of their waking hours with. While creating complete autonomy over team selection is structurally challenging, pioneering organizations are proving it possible. At Whole Foods, prospective employees must pass a 30-day trial period, after which their immediate peers, not corporate managers, vote on whether to hire them permanently. At W.L. Gore and Associates, leaders are not appointed from above. They must organically attract individuals who are actively willing to follow them. When people possess the freedom to assemble their own collaborative groups, the resulting teams are significantly more cohesive and satisfied than those forcefully assigned by an organizational chart. Mastering the art of autonomy does not mean abandoning the concept of accountability. It merely changes the mechanism by which accountability is achieved. The outdated operating system of the 20th century assumed that freedom was a loophole for laziness, requiring heavy supervision to extract effort. The new paradigm operates on the belief that human beings fundamentally want to be accountable, and that granting them complete control over their task, time, technique, and team is the most direct pathway to ensuring they deliver their absolute best. While transitioning from a culture of compliance to a culture of engagement requires careful scaffolding and patience, it aligns perfectly with the overarching trajectory of human history. We are not designed to be passive instruments of someone else's will. We are meant to be the autonomous authors of our own extraordinary lives. Chapter 5. Mastery. In the summer of 1944, a 10-year-old boy named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi stood on a train platform in Budapest, surrounded by fleeing relatives as the devastation of World War II closed in on Hungary. As the train rumbled toward Italy, bombs detonated in the distance and rifle fire shattered the windows. Crouched beneath his seat in terror, The young boy was struck by a profound and unsettling realization. The adults in his world had absolutely no idea how to live. The war had shattered their lives, destroying their wealth, their security, and in many cases their physical existence. Watching the adults around him crumble under the weight of this collapse, the young boy made a silent vow to find a better, more resilient way to exist, a way of living that could not be so easily destroyed by external circumstances. This childhood epiphany forms the bedrock of our understanding of human engagement. To comprehend the trajectory of a fulfilling life, one must understand the fundamental difference between control and autonomy. Control is a mechanism designed to produce compliance. When we are controlled by external forces, whether by a dictatorial regime, a rigid corporate hierarchy, or an outdated system of rewards and punishments, our natural response is to comply with the demands placed upon us just enough to survive. For the routine, algorithmic tasks of the industrial era, this compliance was a sufficient economic strategy. But compliance is a terrible strategy for personal fulfillment, and it is woefully inadequate for the complex conceptual challenges of the modern world. Autonomy, by contrast, leads not to compliance, but to engagement, and only through deep, sustained engagement can a human being achieve mastery, the profound desire to get continually better at something that matters. The tragedy of the modern workplace is that it remains a monument to compliance. A staggering majority of employees report feeling entirely disengaged from their daily labor, a psychological deficit that costs the global economy hundreds of billions of dollars in lost potential. We have built our institutions upon a paradigm that demands obedience but starves the human spirit. To find the antidote to this modern malaise, we must return to Csikszentmihalyi's lifelong quest. After dropping out of high school and wandering across Europe, he eventually stumbled upon the lectures of Carl Jung, discovering that the field of psychology might hold the answers he sought. Arriving in the United States as a penniless immigrant, he immersed himself in the study of play and creativity, observing painters who worked in trances so deep they forgot to eat, sleep, or even acknowledge the passage of time. They were entirely engaged in autotelic experiences, activities where the goal was not an external reward, but the sheer self-fulfilling joy of the activity itself. To quantify this elusive state of mind, Csikszentmihalyi pioneered a revolutionary method, outfitting participants with electronic pages that beeped at random intervals throughout the day. Whenever the alarm sounded, participants recorded exactly what they were doing and how they felt. Through thousands of these real-time snapshots, a vivid picture of the optimal human experience emerged. He named this state flow. In flow, goals are crystal clear and feedback is instantaneous. Most critically, flow occurs when the challenge of a task perfectly matches an individual's abilities, stretching their mind and body just a notch beyond their current capacity. In these moments, self-consciousness dissolves, time warps, and the individual becomes entirely fused with the task at hand. They are fully autonomous, deeply engaged, and experiencing the highest form of human satisfaction. This psychological revelation eventually caught the attention of the global economic elite. During a gathering in Davos, Switzerland, Csikszentmihalyi found himself dining with several Nobel laureate economists who conceded that traditional economic models failed to adequately explain human behavior because they ignored these deep, intrinsic drivers. Slowly, visionary organizations began to realize that cultivating flow was not just a humanistic ideal, but a supreme competitive advantage. Companies like the Swedish logistics giant Green Cargo pulled themselves from the brink of financial ruin by fundamentally restructuring management to focus on employee engagement, training executives to constantly evaluate whether their staff felt overwhelmed or underwhelmed, and adjusting their duties accordingly. These enlightened organizations rely on two primary tactics. First, they provide their people with Goldilocks tasks, challenges that are neither too hot with anxiety nor too cold with boredom, but perfectly calibrated to stretch their skills. Second, they actively encourage the positive side of the Sawyer effect, empowering employees to transform mundane work into engaging play. Even in inherently routine jobs, when workers are given the freedom to sculpt their own responsibilities, they will often reinvent their daily tasks to inject meaning, challenge, and flow into their routines. Yet, while flow is the essential catalyst, it is merely a momentary state of being. Mastery, on the other hand, is a lifelong pursuit. Flow happens in the span of an afternoon. Mastery unfolds over the span of decades. To convert the ephemeral magic of flow into the enduring achievement of mastery, individuals must navigate 3 immutable laws. The first law dictates that mastery is a mindset. As behavioral science has conclusively demonstrated, human beings generally hold one of 2 theories about their own intelligence. Those operating under an entity theory believe that talent is fixed, finite, and carved in stone. For them, every challenge is a terrifying test of their inherent worth, leading them to avoid difficult tasks that might expose their limitations. They require a steady diet of easy successes to validate their fragile egos. Conversely, those operating under an incremental theory recognize that capability is malleable, a muscle that grows stronger with exertion. They embrace learning goals over performance goals, viewing effort not as a sign of weakness, but as the only mechanism for growth. When faced with catastrophic setbacks, they do not collapse into helplessness. They analyze their failures as necessary guideposts on the long road to improvement. Without this expansive, resilient mindset, mastery is impossible. The second law warns that mastery is a pain. The path to greatness is not a joyful, effortless sprint. It is an agonizingly long marathon of deliberate practice. Studies of elite athletes, musicians, and military cadets reveal that the most accurate predictor of success is not innate genius, but grit, a ferocious, unyielding passion and perseverance for long-term goals. True mastery requires thousands of hours of highly repetitive, mentally demanding, and frequently exhausting effort. It demands a ruthless focus on one's own weaknesses and a willingness to exist on frustrating plateaus for years at a time. The work is grueling and profoundly mundane, but the willingness to endure this friction is precisely what separates the master from the amateur. The third and final law reveals that mastery is an asymptote. In algebra, an asymptote is a straight line that a curve infinitely approaches but never actually touches. This is the inescapable, bittersweet nature of perfection. Even the most celebrated artists, like Paul Cézanne, spent their twilight years obsessively reworking their canvases, forever stalking an idealized vision they knew they could never fully capture. The greatest athletes in human history inevitably walk off the field believing they could have performed just a fraction better. Mastery is a horizon that recedes exactly as fast as you sprint toward it. You can draw incredibly, breathtakingly close, but you can never physically cross the finish line. It is this very impossibility that makes the pursuit so enduringly alluring. To treat this pursuit as an optional luxury is to fundamentally misunderstand the human operating system. In a startling psychological experiment, researchers asked healthy individuals to systematically remove all moments of flow and autotelic play from their daily routines. Within just 48 hours, the participants exhibited the clinical symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. They suffered from severe concentration loss, physical sluggishness, insomnia, and hostility. Depriving a human being of the opportunity to engage deeply in challenging, meaningful work induces a state akin to psychological suffocation. Flow and the subsequent pursuit of mastery are not mere corporate perks. They are the oxygen of the soul. Children understand this instinctively. They careen through their early years in a perpetual state of flow, fearlessly testing their environments and pushing their capacities to the absolute limit. It is only when they are subjected to the rigid, compliance-driven structures of modern schooling and traditional management that this innate drive is slowly suffocated. To build a life of genuine meaning and to build organizations capable of greatness, we must discard the cynical assumption that humans require coercion. We must reconnect with our most fundamental nature and allow ourselves to become deeply, irrevocably engaged in the pursuit of something that matters. Chapter 6. Purpose. Demographics and the inevitability of unfulfilled desires are currently colliding to reshape the landscape of human motivation. Beginning in the early 2000s, the vanguard of the baby boom generation started crossing the threshold of their 60th birthdays. This chronological milestone typically triggers a profound period of reflection, sparking a predictable psychological progression. In the first stage, individuals are struck by the sheer velocity of time, tallying their accumulated regrets and realizing that the youthful illusions of invincibility have faded. Following this initial shock comes a secondary realization. Modern medicine and prosperous living conditions mean that a 60-year-old today likely has another quarter of a century left to live. A wave of relief washes over them as they recognize the substantial horizon still stretching out ahead. Yet this relief is quickly overshadowed by a third, more demanding stage of reckoning. Looking back at how rapidly the previous 25 years vanished, these individuals are seized by an urgent question. When will they finally do something that genuinely matters? This existential hunger for significance is no longer a fringe philosophical crisis. It is a mass phenomenon. Because of the unprecedented size of this demographic cohort, a staggering number of people are simultaneously interrogating the meaning of their lives. Every few minutes, day and night, hundreds of individuals are entering an age of deep reflection, pivoting away from the pursuit of mere accumulation and toward a desperate search for significance. This demographic tsunami is creating an overwhelming demand for a life aligned with true meaning. This massive cultural shift directly highlights the purpose motive, the vital third leg of the motivational tripod. While autonomy and mastery are indispensable for high performance, they require a broader context to achieve true balance. The most resilient and deeply driven individuals consistently hitch their personal ambitions to a cause far larger than themselves. Under the old operating system of the 20th century, purpose was treated as a decorative accessory, a pleasant corporate illusion to maintain public relations, provided it never interfered with the serious business of maximizing shareholder value. That mechanistic worldview completely ignored a fundamental aspect of human nature. From the dawn of civilization, we have been a species that seeks to understand our place in the universe and endeavors to leave a legacy that outlasts our physical existence. Today, the inadequacy of the purely profit-driven model is laid bare by contrasting social trends. As workplace engagement plummets to catastrophic lows, participation in unpaid, voluntary work has surged. This divergence clearly indicates that people are finding the spiritual nourishment in their unpaid community service that their compensated labor utterly fails to provide. The singular pursuit of wealth lacks the emotional gravity required to fully mobilize human energy. The new operational paradigm does not discard the necessity of profit, but it demands that profit be elevated and equalized with the pursuit of purpose. This evolution is already beginning to manifest in how modern organizations define their goals. The generation entering the workforce today shares the aging generation's desire for a remixed set of rewards. They prioritize non-monetary compensation, seeking collaborative environments and the ability to contribute to the social good over sheer financial gain. This has given rise to hybrid enterprises that defy traditional categorization. Businesses are emerging whose core operational model integrates philanthropy directly into their revenue streams, transforming everyday consumers into active benefactors. If evaluated through the lens of traditional economics, a company that donates a product for every product sold seems like an unsustainable anomaly. But within a framework that maximizes purpose, these ventures thrive, proving that profit can serve as the engine for a much deeper societal mission. The transformation is equally apparent in the changing words echoing through corporate corridors. In the wake of catastrophic financial crises driven by systemic greed, the upcoming generation of business leaders recognized that the traditional path of ruthless wealth accumulation had led to moral bankruptcy. In response, students at elite business schools began drafting ethical oaths, pledging their careers to the greater good, sustainable prosperity, and the safeguarding of society. The vocabulary of the modern enterprise is slowly shifting. To humanize corporate behavior, we must first humanize the language we use to describe it. A simple metric for this cultural health is the pronoun test. When employees describe their organization using the word they, it signals a deep alienation and a workforce treated as disposable machinery. When they use the word we, it reveals an engaged community united by a shared, meaningful vision. To bridge the gap between spoken ideals and actual practice, organizations must fundamentally restructure their policies. Traditional corporate ethics programs often devolve into mere compliance checklists, essentially bribing employees to follow the rules to avoid legal penalties. This extrinsic approach actively degrades a person's intrinsic desire to act morally. True purpose is cultivated when autonomy is enlisted in the service of the greater good. For instance, redirecting corporate charitable funds directly into the hands of employees, Allowing them to choose the beneficiaries transforms a sterile corporate tax write-off into a deeply satisfying, autonomous act of giving. Similarly, in high-stress professions plagued by burnout, allowing practitioners to dedicate a portion of their week entirely to the aspect of their work they find most meaningful, whether that is community service, research, or direct care, dramatically reduces emotional exhaustion. It is the integration of self-directed freedom with a transcendent objective. Ultimately, this evolution challenges our most basic assumptions about the good life. Extensive psychological tracking of young adults entering the professional world has revealed a devastating paradox regarding the pursuit of success. Those who organize their lives around intrinsic purpose-driven aspirations, such as helping others or mastering a craft, reported high levels of subjective well-being as they achieved their aims. However, those who successfully attained their extrinsic, profit-driven goals, accumulating wealth and securing public acclaim, experienced no increase in happiness whatsoever. In fact, despite getting exactly what they wanted, these individuals showed marked increases in anxiety, depression, and psychological distress. The tragic flaw of the old societal operating system is the belief that attaining external validations will somehow cure our internal unrest. Chasing profit without a tether to purpose leads to a profound emptiness. When the financial goal is reached and the emptiness remains, the individual often assumes the goal simply wasn't large enough, driving them further down a path of anxiety and isolation. History's greatest triumphs, from the birth of democratic institutions to the eradication of diseases, were not fueled by the desire for quarterly earnings. They were ignited by the pursuit of purpose. We stand at a unique intersection of scientific understanding and demographic reality. We now possess empirical proof that human beings are not beasts of burden requiring constant behavioral manipulation. We are designed to be active, engaged, and autonomous. The richest moments of our existence do not occur when we are eagerly awaiting a reward or cowering from a punishment. They happen when we are listening to our own internal voice, dedicating our energy to something that truly matters and offering our finest efforts in the service of a cause far greater than ourselves. Aligning our institutions with this undeniable truth is no longer just a strategy for economic survival. It is a necessary affirmation of our shared humanity.